On a cloudy suburban afternoon, a lady pushes a baby stroller along the uneven sidewalk of a closed-down supermarket. Inside the stroller, a quiet baby follows a forgotten corner of the parking lot with a fixed gaze. As they get closer, the baby raises its arm and points to a shopping cart covered with dirty cloths inside it. A huddled German shepherd breathes with difficulty without making a sound. A security guard appears in the background and watches in silence. Without interfering, the grandmother hesitates but doesn't move away. The baby takes the pacifier out of its mouth and gives it to the dog. And for a second, everything stopped. Love stories with animals, then subscribe now and don't miss any. Thank you for following us. Now back to our story. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maple Street, painting the quiet suburban neighborhood in golden hues that spoke of routine and comfort. Dorothy Dot Henderson adjusted her grip on the stroller handle, her weathered hands steady despite her 72 years. Baby Tommy, barely 18 months old, sat contentedly in his seat, his bright blue eyes taking in the familiar sights of their daily walk. For the past 6 months, since her daughter Sarah had returned to work at the county hospital, Dot had embraced her role as full-time caretaker with the determination that had carried her through decades of raising her own children. Today's route would take them past the old Riverside Shopping Center, a relic from the 1980s that had been shuttered for nearly 3 years. The once bustling parking lot now served as an unofficial playground for neighborhood kids and a shortcut for pedestrians heading to the newer strip mall on Cedar Avenue. Dot preferred this path because it was quieter, away from the heavy traffic on Main Street, and Tommy seemed to enjoy watching the occasional squirrel dart between the scattered shopping carts that the city hadn't yet bothered to remove. The cracked asphalt told stories of better times when families would pile into station wagons for weekly grocery runs, and teenagers would gather around the old arcade entrance. Now, weeds pushed through the pavement seams, and the faded yellow parking lines had become abstract art. A few abandoned shopping carts dotted the landscape like metal monuments to consumer culture's past, their wheels rusted and bodies dented from exposure to countless storms. As they approached the far corner of the lot, near where a concrete retaining wall separated the shopping center from the drainage creek beyond, Tommy began to fidget in his stroller. His chubby arms waved with unusual urgency, and he pointed persistently toward a cluster of shopping carts lined up against the wall. Dot had learned to read her grandson's signals over these months together, and something in his excited babbling made her pause. "What is it, sweetie?" she murmured, following the direction of his insistent pointing. "What's got you all worked up?" The baby's excitement grew more pronounced as they moved closer to the shopping carts. His usual contentment was replaced by an animated energy that Dot had rarely seen, except when he spotted his favorite stuffed elephant or heard the ice cream truck's distant melody. But this was different somehow, more urgent, more purposeful. When they were about 20 feet away from the carts, Dot noticed something that made her heart skip. One of the carts, pushed against the retaining wall and partially hidden by overgrown bushes, contained what looked like a pile of old blankets. But as her eyes adjusted to the shadows, she realized the blankets were moving with a rhythm that suggested breathing. Her first instinct was to turn around, to protect Tommy from whatever homeless person might be sleeping rough in the abandoned lot. But Tommy's excited pointing persisted, and something in his pure, trusting expression convinced her to take a few steps closer. As a grandmother who had lived through enough surprises to trust her instincts, Dot approached cautiously, her maternal protective instincts fully engaged. What she discovered made her gasp softly. Curled up in the shopping cart, wrapped in a dirty but once expensive-looking blanket, was a German shepherd. The dog was clearly exhausted, its breathing labored and shallow. Its coat, which should have been thick and lustrous, was matted and dulled by dirt and neglect. The animal's eyes were half closed, but there was an alertness there that suggested it was aware of their presence. "Oh my goodness," Dot whispered, her hand instinctively moving to Tommy's stroller to ensure he was secure. The dog showed no signs of aggression, just a weary resignation that broke her heart. Its collar was still intact, though dirty, and she could see what looked like a small metal tag hanging from it. Tommy's babbling grew more excited, and before Dot could react, the toddler had pulled his pacifier from his mouth. With the innocent generosity that only children possess, he extended his little arm toward the cart, offering his most prized possession to the suffering animal. The gesture was so pure, so unexpected, that Dot felt tears spring to her eyes. The German Shepherd lifted its head slightly, those intelligent brown eyes focusing on the small child who sat just out of reach. There was no menace in the dog's gaze, only a profound sadness mixed with something that might have been hope. The animal made no move toward the pacifier, but its tail twitched slightly, a sign that somewhere beneath the exhaustion and fear, there was still life and spirit. "Well, I'll be damned," came a gravelly voice from behind them. Dot turned to see Frank Martinez, the security guard who made irregular rounds through the abandoned shopping center. Frank was a man in his late 50s, with silver-streaked hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many night shifts and not enough sleep. He'd been working security for various properties around town for over a decade, and Dot had seen him occasionally during their walks. He had the weathered look of someone who'd seen enough of life's harsh realities to expect the worst. But something in his expression suggested he was as moved by Tommy's gesture as she was. "How long do you think he's been there?" Dot asked, keeping her voice low so as not to startle the dog. Frank approached slowly, his trained eye taking in the scene. "Hard to say. Could be days, could be longer. Poor thing looks like he's been through hell." He paused, studying the animal more carefully. "That's a purebred German Shepherd, though. Someone's missing a valuable dog, or—" He left the sentence hanging, but Dot understood the implication. "We can't just leave him here," she said. Though even as the words left her mouth, she wondered what exactly they could do. She was a retired school teacher living on a fixed income, hardly equipped to take in a large dog that clearly needed medical attention. Frank nodded slowly. "No, ma'am, we can't, but finding help for a dog in this condition—" He shook his head. "Folks around here aren't exactly known for taking in strays, especially big ones like this." Tommy continued to hold out his pacifier, his young face serious with concentration. The dog's eyes remained fixed on the child, and Dot could swear she saw something shift in the animal's expression. It wasn't quite trust, but it was a recognition of kindness, perhaps the first the dog had experienced in however long it had been surviving on its own. "There's got to be someone," Dot said, her voice carrying the determination that had served her well through years of teaching reluctant students and raising stubborn children. "No creature deserves to suffer like this, especially not when there's a child involved who clearly wants to help." Frank studied her for a moment, then looked back at Tommy, who was still patiently offering his pacifier to the German Shepherd. Something in the security guard's weathered features softened, as if the innocence of the gesture had awakened something in him that years of disappointment had nearly buried. "All right," he said finally. "Let's see what we can do. But it's not going to be easy. This town's got more problems than solutions when it comes to helping animals, and people are going to have opinions about taking in a dog we know nothing about." As if to emphasize Frank's point, the distant sound of traffic from Main Street reminded them that they were still in the middle of town, where practical concerns often outweighed compassionate impulses. But Tommy's continued offering of his pacifier seemed to create a bubble of possibility around them, a space where doing the right thing felt not only possible but necessary. The German Shepherd's breathing seemed to steady slightly, as if the presence of these three humans, a grandmother, a baby, and a security guard had provided some small comfort. Its eyes remained alert, but calm, watching Tommy with an intensity that suggested recognition of the child's pure intention. Dot made her decision. Frank, do you know anyone who might help? A veterinarian, an animal shelter, someone who won't just... She couldn't finish the sentence, but Frank understood. There's a small place on the other side of town, Riverside Animal Haven. It's not much more than a couple of volunteers and a big heart, but they might be willing to take a look. He paused, studying the dog again. Course, we'll need to figure out how to transport him safely. He might be gentle now, but a scared animal can be unpredictable. As they stood there, planning their next move, none of them could have predicted that this chance encounter would unravel a mystery that had been buried for years, or that the tired German shepherd in the shopping cart would prove to be far more than just another abandoned animal. The afternoon sun continued its lazy descent toward the horizon, casting longer shadows across the empty parking lot. But somehow the gathering darkness felt less ominous with their small group united in purpose. The next few hours proved to be an exercise in human nature at its most complex. Frank had made some calls from his security booth, and while they waited for responses, Dot found herself studying the German shepherd more closely. The dog had accepted a small amount of water from Frank's thermos, lapping it gratefully from the cap he'd offered. Tommy remained fascinated, continuing to babble at their new four-legged friend with the unwavering optimism that only toddlers possessed. Mrs. Henderson, Frank said, returning from his third phone call. I've got some news. And not all of it's good. Dot looked up from where she'd been sitting on a concrete parking barrier, keeping Tommy entertained while staying close enough to monitor the dog. Let me guess people aren't exactly jumping at the chance to help. That's putting it mildly. Frank's expression was grim. The city animal control said they'd come get him, but... He glanced meaningfully at Tommy, then back at Dot. Well, let's just say that's not the kind of help we're looking for. The implication hung heavy between them. Dot had lived in this community long enough to know that the municipal animal services were overwhelmed and underfunded. A sick stray, even a purebred one, would likely face a grim future if that was their only option. What about the place you mentioned, Riverside Animal Haven? That's the good news, sort of. They're willing to take a look at him. But they're operating on a shoestring budget and they're already at capacity. The woman I talked to, Linda Chen, said she could maybe squeeze him in for a few days, but finding him a permanent home... Frank shrugged helplessly. As if sensing the weight of their conversation, the German shepherd lifted his head slightly, those intelligent eyes moving between the three humans who seemed to be deciding his fate. There was no pleading in his gaze, just a patient resignation that somehow made the situation even more heartbreaking. We have to try, Dot said firmly, even if it's just to get him checked by a veterinarian and cleaned up. Maybe once people see him healthy, they'll be more willing to consider adoption. Frank nodded slowly. I can borrow my brother-in-law's pickup truck. We'll need something to make him comfortable for the ride, and we'll have to be careful. He seems docile enough. But you never know how an animal will react when you try to move them. While Frank went to make arrangements for transportation, Dot called her daughter Sarah at the hospital. The conversation didn't go as smoothly as she'd hoped. Mom, are you serious right now? Sarah's voice carried the strain of a 12-hour shift in the emergency department. You found a stray dog and you want to... What, exactly? We can't take in a large animal. You know that. The lease on your apartment specifically prohibits pets over 20 pounds. I'm not asking to keep him permanently, sweetheart. I just think we need to help get him to safety. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mom, I know you mean well, but think about this practically. You're 72 years old, and you're already taking care of Tommy full-time. A sick dog is a huge responsibility. And what if he's aggressive? What if he has diseases? What if Tommy gets hurt? These were all valid concerns, and Dot knew her daughter was speaking from a place of love and worry. But every time she looked at Tommy, still chattering happily at the German Shepherd from his stroller, she remembered the pure generosity of his gesture with the pacifier. How could she teach him that kindness mattered if she didn't follow through when it was difficult? "Sarah, honey, sometimes the right thing to do isn't the practical thing to do." Another pause. "Just promise me you'll be careful, okay? And if this gets too complicated or expensive, you'll step back and let someone else handle it." After ending the call, Dot approached several of her neighbors, hoping to find someone willing to help or at least offer support. The responses were a disappointing mix of indifference, suspicion, and outright hostility. "Dorothy, I swear, you always were too soft-hearted for your own good," said Mrs. Peterson from 2 houses down. "That dog could be diseased, could be dangerous. And for all you know, this is some kind of scam. People abandon animals in public places, hoping some bleeding heart will take them in and then ask for donations online." Mr. Riley, who lived across the street, was more direct. "Look, Dot, I've got nothing against dogs, but we've got our own problems in this neighborhood. Property values are already struggling with that eyesore of a shopping center sitting empty. Last thing we need is word getting out that we're a dumping ground for unwanted animals." Even Martha Williams, who Dot had considered a close friend for over 20 years, expressed reservations. "I just don't understand why you're getting involved, Dorothy. There are organizations that handle these things. Why make it your personal responsibility?" The rejections stung, but they also strengthened Dot's resolve. She'd spent 40 years as an elementary school teacher, and she'd learned that sometimes the most important lessons came from the situations that challenged people to choose between comfort and compassion. When Frank returned with a borrowed pickup truck and an old blanket to line the truck bed, they faced their next challenge: actually moving the German Shepherd. The dog had remained in the shopping cart throughout the afternoon, occasionally lifting his head to watch their activities, but showing no inclination to move on his own. "Easy, boy," Frank murmured, approaching slowly with his hands visible. "Nobody's going to hurt you. We're just trying to help." To their surprise, the dog allowed Frank to reach into the cart and gently assess his condition. The animal was clearly dehydrated and underweight, but there were no obvious injuries. More remarkably, when Frank began to carefully lift him from the cart, the German Shepherd offered no resistance, as if he understood that these humans meant him no harm. Tommy clapped his hands excitedly as they transferred the dog to the truck bed, where Frank had arranged the blanket into a comfortable nest. The dog settled immediately, his breathing still labored, but his eyes alert and watchful. The drive to Riverside Animal Haven took them through the older part of town, where Victorian houses sat alongside post-war bungalows, and the occasional modern renovation stuck out like a bright tooth in a weathered smile. Tommy dozed in his car seat while Dot rode in the back of the truck with the German Shepherd, her hand resting gently on his fur to provide comfort and monitor his condition. Linda Chen met them at the shelter entrance. A woman in her 40s, with paint-stained clothes and hands that spoke of someone who worked with her heart as much as her head. The Riverside Animal Haven was housed in a converted warehouse, and the sound of barking from inside suggested they were indeed operating at capacity. "This is him?" Linda asked, approaching the truck bed cautiously. "He's beautiful, even in this condition. German Shepherds are wonderful dogs, but they're also a huge commitment. Training, exercise, healthcare, it all adds up fast." As Linda examined the dog with gentle, experienced hands, she frowned. "There's something different about this one. See how he responds to basic commands. Watch this." She pointed downward and said firmly, "Down!" To everyone's amazement, the German Shepherd immediately lowered himself to his belly, his eyes fixed on Linda's face with an intensity that suggested formal training. That's interesting, Linda murmured. This isn't just a pet who got lost. This dog has had professional training, probably extensive training. She checked his ears, looked at his teeth, and ran her hands along his body with the thoroughness of someone who'd seen every kind of animal emergency. And he's been well cared for until recently. This isn't a dog who's been living rough for months. Something happened to separate him from his family. And it happened relatively recently. The implications of Linda's observations settled over the group like a puzzle with missing pieces. If the dog had been professionally trained and well cared for, where was his family? How had he ended up alone in a shopping cart, miles from anywhere? We'll keep him for a few days, Linda said finally. Get him checked by our veterinarian. Cleaned up, fed properly. But I have to be honest with you folks, this isn't a long-term solution. We're a small operation, and dogs like this need more than we can provide indefinitely. As they prepared to leave the German Shepherd in Linda's capable hands, Tommy began to fuss, reaching toward the dog with obvious distress. The animal lifted his head at the sound of the child's cries, and for a moment, their eyes met across the distance between truck and shelter entrance. Something passed between them in that moment, something that none of the adults could quite define, but all of them recognized as significant. The dog's tail moved slightly, and Tommy's crying ceased, replaced by a solemn stare that seemed far too knowing for such a young child. We'll come back tomorrow to check on him, Dot promised Linda, though she wasn't sure what they could accomplish with another visit. And if you learn anything about where he came from, and please let us know. As Frank drove them home through the gathering dusk, none of them spoke much. Tommy had fallen asleep in his car seat, his small hand still clutching the pacifier he'd tried to give away earlier. The streets of their neighborhood looked different somehow, as if the afternoon's events had shifted their perspective on the familiar landscape of their daily lives. What none of them realized was that their simple act of kindness had set in motion a chain of events that would soon reveal secrets buried for years, and that the German Shepherd they'd just rescued was about to become the center of a mystery that would challenge everything they thought they knew about their quiet community. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez arrived at Riverside Animal Haven early the next morning, her veterinary bag in one hand and a coffee in the other. She'd been volunteering her services at the shelter for 3 years now, ever since her private practice had become successful enough to allow her the luxury of pro bono work. Linda had called her the night before about the German Shepherd, describing the dog's condition and the mysterious circumstances of his discovery. He's in the isolation room, Linda explained, leading Dr. Rodriguez through the maze of kennels toward the back of the facility. I wanted to keep him separate until we knew more about his health status. He's been cooperative, but there's something about him that's different. The German Shepherd was lying quietly on a thick dog bed, his head raised alertly as they approached. Even after just one night of regular meals and clean water, there was a noticeable improvement in his appearance. His eyes were brighter, his breathing more even, and his coat, while still in need of professional grooming, had begun to show hints of its natural luster. "Hello, handsome," Dr. Rodriguez said softly, approaching with the careful respect she'd learned to show all patients, regardless of species. "Let's see what's going on with you." The examination revealed a dog in surprisingly good health, considering his recent circumstances. He was underweight and dehydrated, but there were no signs of serious illness or injury. His teeth were clean and well-maintained. His vaccinations appeared to be current based on the small puncture scars on his neck, and his overall muscle tone suggested regular exercise and proper nutrition until very recently. "This dog has been someone's pride and joy," Dr. Rodriguez told Linda. "Look at his paws, perfect nail trim, no overgrowth. His ears are clean, no infection. Whoever owned him took excellent care of him until very recently." As she continued her examination, Dr. Rodriguez felt along the dog's neck and shoulders for the telltale bump of a microchip. "Bingo," she said, locating the small device just beneath the skin between his shoulder blades. Let's see what this tells us. The microchip scanner beeped as it read the unique identification number. Doctor. Rodriguez wrote down the digits and immediately accessed the National Pet Recovery Database on her phone. Within moments, information began to populate on her screen. His name is Major, she announced, reading from the display. Registered to... She paused, frowning at the screen. This is odd. The owner is listed as Robert Chen, but the status shows deceased, and the date indicates he passed away 5 years ago. Linda leaned over to look at the screen. Chen. That's my surname too, but I've never heard of a Robert Chen with a German Shepherd. Dr. Rodriguez scrolled through the additional information. It says here that Robert Chen was the owner of Chen's Canine Training Academy and that he perished in a facility fire 5 years ago. But if that's true, how is Major in such good condition? Someone's been caring for him all this time. The mystery deepened as they discovered more inconsistencies in the database. The microchip registration listed Major's breed as German Shepherd, but his age was recorded as 12 years old, which would make him quite elderly for a large breed dog. Yet the animal before them appeared to be in his prime, perhaps 5 or 6 years old at most. There's something not right about these records, Dr. Rodriguez muttered, taking photos of the information on her phone. Either the chip was programmed incorrectly, or someone's been maintaining false information in the system. As if sensing that he was the subject of intense discussion, Major stood and walked to the examination table, sitting with perfect posture and fixing his gaze on Dr. Rodriguez. The movement was so precise, so controlled, that both women stopped talking to watch. He's trying to tell us something, Linda said quietly. Look at the way he's positioned himself. That's not natural dog behavior, that's trained behavior. Dr. Rodriguez held up her hand in a stay gesture, and Major remained perfectly still. She then pointed to the floor and said, "Down," and he immediately complied, lowering himself with military precision. When she said heel, he moved to her left side and sat, his shoulder aligned with her leg, exactly as trained protection dogs were taught to position themselves. "This isn't just any trained dog, Doctor," Rodriguez said, her voice filled with amazement. "This is a working dog. Police, military, or maybe therapy work. The level of training is too sophisticated for a regular pet." Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Dot, Frank, and Tommy. The baby immediately became excited upon seeing Major, clapping his hands and babbling with obvious joy. Major's response was equally immediate. His entire demeanor shifted from alert professionalism to gentle warmth, and he approached the stroller with careful, measured steps. "Well, would you look at that?" Frank said, observing the interaction. "It's like he remembers the little guy." Dr. Rodriguez explained their discoveries about the microchip and the mysterious registration information. As she spoke, Frank's expression grew increasingly thoughtful. "Robert Chen," he repeated slowly. "You know, that name sounds familiar. I think I remember something about a training facility fire a few years back. It was in the papers because it happened near the children's hospital, and there were concerns about smoke affecting the patients." "You remember more details?" Linda asked hopefully. Frank scratched his chin. "Not much, but I think there was something unusual about the whole situation. The fire happened at night, when the facility should have been empty. But they found evidence that dogs had been there recently. Some of the equipment was missing too, if I recall correctly." As they talked, Tommy had managed to work his pacifier out of his mouth again and was holding it toward Major. This time, the dog gently took the pacifier in his mouth, held it for a moment, then carefully placed it back in the toddler's outstretched hand. The gesture was so deliberate, so thoughtful, that all the adults fell silent. That's not normal dog behavior either," Dr. Rodriguez said quietly. "That's therapy dog behavior. He's been trained to interact with children, probably children in medical settings." The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a picture, though it was still far from complete. Major wasn't just a lost pet, he was a specially trained working dog whose official records didn't match his current condition or age. Someone had been caring for him since the fire that had allegedly ended his first owner's life. But who and why were they no longer caring for him? "We need to do some more research," Dot said finally. "There's a story here, and I think Major deserves to have it told properly." Dr. Rodriguez nodded. "I'll reach out to some colleagues who work with therapy animals. Maybe someone knows about this Robert Chen or the training academy. And I'll see if I can find any records of Major being certified for therapy work." As they prepared to leave, Linda made an announcement that surprised everyone. "I've been thinking about this all night, and I've decided Major can stay here as long as necessary. We'll make room. A dog with this level of training and this gentle temperament with children doesn't deserve to be shuttled around from place to place while we figure out his story." Frank offered to help with the additional costs, and Dot promised to visit daily with Tommy, whose obvious bond with Major seemed to be helping both of them in ways none of the adults fully understood. But as they left the shelter that afternoon, none of them noticed the woman sitting in a silver sedan across the street, watching their every move through tinted windows. She'd been following the story since the previous evening, when a social media post about a found German Shepherd had caught her attention. The description of the dog and the location where he'd been found had sent chills down her spine. Claire Morrison had spent 5 years building a new life, far from the secrets and mistakes of her past. She'd changed her appearance, her name, even her accent, all in service of escaping the guilt that had consumed her after the fire at Robert Chen's training academy. She'd thought Major had perished along with the other dogs that terrible night, when her carelessness had set in motion a chain of events that destroyed everything Robert had built. But now, Major was alive, and worse, he was attracting attention. Soon, people would start asking questions about the fire, about the missing therapy dogs, about what had really happened that night 5 years ago, questions that could unravel everything she'd worked so hard to build. Claire started her car and pulled away from the curb, her mind racing with plans and possibilities. She needed to get Major back before anyone discovered the truth about who she really was and what she'd done. The dog was the last living witness to her mistakes, and she couldn't afford to let others uncover the secrets she'd buried with such care. As the silver sedan disappeared into traffic, Major lifted his head inside the shelter, his keen senses detecting a familiar scent carried on the evening breeze. His body tensed with recognition and something that might have been fear, but the moment passed quickly. The scent faded, and with it, the last reminder of a past he'd been trained to forget. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new questions, and new dangers. But tonight, for the first time in months, Major felt safe enough to sleep deeply, surrounded by the sounds of other rescued animals and the lingering scent of the child who had offered him kindness when he'd had nothing left to hope for. 3 days had passed since Major's arrival at Riverside Animal Haven, and his transformation was remarkable. Linda's dedicated care, combined with Dr. Rodriguez's medical attention, had restored much of his natural vitality. His coat had regained its lustrous sheen, his eyes sparkled with intelligence, and his movements showed the confident bearing of a dog who knew his worth. More importantly, his daily visits with Tommy had established a routine that seemed beneficial to both of them. Dot had made good on her promise to visit daily, and each afternoon she would push Tommy's stroller through the shelter doors to find Major waiting with what could only be described as anticipation. The dog had claimed a spot near the front window where he could watch for their arrival, and Linda swore he could tell time, becoming restless every day around 2 o'clock. It was during one of these afternoon visits that everything changed. Dot was sitting on the floor of the shelter's main room, watching Tommy crawl around while Major maintained a protective position nearby. when Linda answered a knock at the front door. Through the window, Dot could see a well-dressed woman in her early 30s, with shoulder-length blonde hair and expensive-looking clothing that seemed out of place in the humble shelter setting. "I'm here about the German Shepherd," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight accent that Dot couldn't quite place. "I believe you have my dog." Linda's expression immediately became cautious. "I'm sorry, which dog are you referring to?" "The male German Shepherd that was found 3 days ago. His name is Rex, and he's been missing for over a week. I've been searching everywhere for him." The woman produced a cell phone and showed Linda what appeared to be a photograph. "This is him, see? I have all his papers at home." Dot felt her heart sink as she overheard the conversation. She'd become attached to Major over these few days, and more importantly, she'd witnessed the genuine bond forming between him and Tommy. The thought of him being reclaimed by his original owner should have been good news, but something about the woman's demeanor made her uneasy. "Ma'am, if you could wait just a moment. I'd like to bring the dog out so you can properly identify him," Linda said diplomatically. "Sometimes people mistake one German Shepherd for another, and we want to be absolutely certain." The woman nodded confidently. "Of course. I'll know my Rex immediately." Linda disappeared into the back room and returned moments later with Major on a leash. The dog entered the main area with his usual confident stride. But Dot noticed an immediate change in his demeanor when he saw the woman. His body language shifted subtly, his ears flattened slightly, his tail lowered, and he moved closer to where Tommy was playing on the floor. "Rex," the woman called out cheerfully, holding out her hand. "Come here, boy, Mama's here." Major looked at the woman, but made no move toward her. Instead, he sat down next to Tommy's play blanket, his eyes fixed on the stranger with an intensity that Dot found concerning. "He's probably just confused after being lost for so long," the woman said quickly, noticing Major's lack of response. "Rex, come, heel." Still no response. Major remained seated, though his posture had become more alert, more protective. Frank chose that moment to arrive for his daily check-in, and Dot felt a wave of relief at seeing the security guard's familiar figure. His presence always made her feel more secure, and right now she needed that stability. "What's going on here?" Frank asked, taking in the scene with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to reading situations quickly. Linda explained about the woman's claim, and Frank studied the stranger with undisguised skepticism. "And you said the dog's name is Rex?" "That's right," the woman replied. But Dot noticed she avoided making eye contact with Frank. "He's been my companion for 3 years. I raised him from a puppy." Frank walked over to Major and spoke quietly. "Major, sit." The dog immediately responded, sitting with perfect posture. Frank tried again. "Major, down." Again, instant compliance. "Interesting," Frank said, turning to face the woman. "Your dog seems to respond to a different name." The woman's composure cracked slightly. "Well, sometimes I call him by different names. Rex. Major, different commands for different situations. You know how it is with dogs." But her explanation rang hollow, especially when Frank continued his impromptu test. He pointed to Tommy and said clearly, "Major, watch." The dog immediately shifted his attention to the toddler, positioning himself so that he could monitor both the child and the adults in the room. It was clearly a trained behavior, executed with precision. "That's quite a coincidence," Frank said dryly, "that your pet dog just happens to have the same professional training commands as the German Shepherd we found." Dot decided to join the conversation. "Mom, I was there when this dog was found. He was in terrible condition, clearly hadn't been cared for in some time. If he's really been your pet for 3 years, how do you explain that?" The woman's story began to shift. "Well, he escaped from my yard over a week ago. I've been searching day and night. He must have gotten into something, or maybe someone else found him first and then abandoned him again when they realized he wasn't their dog." Linda, who had been quietly observing the interaction, stepped forward with a tablet in her hands. "Mom, I ran a check on our lost and found databases. And there's no report of a missing German Shepherd matching this dog's description filed anywhere in the county. If you've been searching for over a week, wouldn't you have reported him missing to animal control?" I was handling the search myself. I didn't think to file an official report." Frank's expression had grown increasingly skeptical. "Can you tell us about his training? Because this dog has clearly had extensive professional education. What commands does he know? What's his background?" The woman hesitated, and in that hesitation, Dot saw uncertainty that contradicted her earlier confidence. "He knows the basic commands. Sit, stay, come, normal dog training." "Watch this," Frank said, and he gave Major a hand signal, a flat palm held vertically in front of his chest. Major immediately dropped to his belly and crawled forward several feet before stopping and looking back for the next command. The silence in the room was profound. Tommy clapped his hands at what he clearly considered an entertaining performance, but the adults understood they had just witnessed something extraordinary. The hand signal Frank had used was military or law enforcement training, not something any pet owner would know or teach. "Mom," Linda said gently but firmly, "I think there's been some confusion here. This dog has professional level training that takes years to develop and costs thousands of dollars. He's also microchipped, and those records don't match the story you're telling us." The woman's facade began to crumble more noticeably. "Look, maybe I was mistaken about some of the details, but I know this is my dog. I can prove it. I have photos at home, registration papers. Everything you need to see. Then I suggest you bring those documents back tomorrow," Frank said evenly, "along with any veterinary records you might have. We'll be happy to review everything and make sure this dog gets back to his rightful owner." "I want to take him with me now," the woman insisted, her voice taking on a harder edge. "He's my property, and I shouldn't have to prove anything to a bunch of volunteers." "Actually, Mom, you do," Linda replied calmly. "We have legal custody of this animal until ownership can be properly established. If you can provide adequate documentation tomorrow, we'll be happy to release him to you." The woman looked around the room, her gaze moving from Linda to Frank to Dot, and finally settling on Major. The dog met her eyes steadily, and something passed between them that none of the humans could interpret, but all of them felt. "Fine," she said finally. "I'll be back tomorrow with everything you need, but I want it understood that you're illegally detaining my animal." After she left, the tension in the room gradually eased, but none of them felt entirely comfortable with what had just transpired. "That woman was lying," Frank said bluntly. "I don't know who she is or what her connection to Major might be, but she's not his owner." Linda nodded slowly. The whole interaction felt wrong. "Did you see how Major reacted to her? Dogs don't typically respond that way to their owners, even after being separated." Dot looked down at Tommy, who had crawled over to Major and was now using the dog's sturdy body to pull himself up to a standing position. Major remained perfectly still, providing a stable support for the toddler's unsteady legs. "There's more to this story," she said quietly. "And I think Major knows exactly what it is." As if in response to her words, Major turned his head to look at her, and for a moment Dot could swear she saw something almost human in his expression, a combination of gratitude, trust, and perhaps a plea for protection from whatever secrets that woman represented. Outside in the parking lot, Claire Morrison sat in her car with shaking hands, replaying every moment of the disastrous encounter. She'd underestimated how much attention the dog would attract, and she'd definitely underestimated the people who had taken him in. The security guard especially had been far too observant, far too knowledgeable about professional dog training. She needed a new approach, and she needed it quickly. The longer Major remained in their custody, the more likely it became that someone would dig deeper into his background and discover the truth about the fire, about Robert Chen. and about her role in the tragedy that had changed everything. Tomorrow, she would return with forged documents and a better story. But tonight, she had planning to do, and perhaps a few phone calls to make to people who understood the importance of keeping certain secrets buried. Frank Martinez had never considered himself a detective, but 30 years of security work had taught him to trust his instincts. And every instinct he possessed was telling him that the woman who claimed to own Major was dangerous. That evening, after leaving the shelter, he drove to the public library on Oak Street, where the elderly librarian, Mrs. Patterson, had known him since he was a teenager getting into trouble downtown. "Frank Martinez," she said with a smile as he approached the reference desk. "What brings you here after all these years? Please tell me you're not researching how to commit the perfect crime." "Nothing like that, Mrs. P. I need to look up some old newspaper articles, 5 years back, about a fire at a dog training facility, something called Chen's Canine Training Academy." Mrs. Patterson's expression grew serious. "Oh yes, I remember that story. Terrible tragedy. Robert Chen was such a nice man, and his work with therapy dogs was remarkable. Let me get you set up with the digital archives." Frank spent the next 2 hours poring over articles from the Tribune Herald, piecing together the story of what had happened 5 years ago. The picture that emerged was both heartbreaking and puzzling. Robert Chen had been a former military dog trainer who had transitioned to civilian work, specializing in therapy animals for hospitals and nursing homes. His facility had housed 12 dogs at the time of the fire, all of them specially trained to work with patients suffering from trauma, terminal illness, or developmental challenges. The fire had started late at night, when the facility should have been empty except for the animals. But here's where the story became strange. While Robert Chen's body had been found in the wreckage, only 8 dogs had been recovered. 4 animals, including a German shepherd named Major, were listed as missing and presumed deceased. The investigation had concluded that Chen had died trying to save his animals, but there were discrepancies in the timeline that had never been fully explained. Frank found an interview with Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the pediatric ward director at St. Mary's Children's Hospital, where Chen's therapy dogs had been regular visitors. Robert was meticulous about his animals, training and care, she had told the reporter. Major was his star pupil, if you can call a dog that. He had an almost supernatural ability to sense when children were in distress and provide exactly the kind of comfort they needed. The article went on to describe how Major had been particularly effective with children undergoing cancer treatment, somehow knowing when to offer gentle companionship and when to provide energetic distraction. "That dog saved more lives than some doctors I know," Dr. Warren had said. "His loss is immeasurable." Frank photographed the relevant articles with his phone, then decided to dig deeper. A search for Claire Morrison yielded nothing significant, but when he expanded his search to include variations of the name, he found something interesting: an obituary for a Claire Chen, Robert's niece, who had supposedly passed away in a car accident 6 months after the fire. But as Frank studied the obituary photo, his blood ran cold. The woman in the grainy black and white image bore a striking resemblance to the blonde woman who had claimed to own Major. Same facial structure, same eyes, even similar nose and mouth. The hair was different, darker and shorter, but that was easily changed. His hands shaking slightly with the implications of what he was discovering, Frank printed the articles and drove directly to Dot's apartment. He found her giving Tommy his evening bath, the toddler splashing happily in the small tub while his grandmother managed to stay mostly dry. "Frank, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," he said grimly, setting the printed articles on her kitchen table. "Dot, I think we're dealing with something much more serious than a simple case of mistaken identity." After Tommy was settled for the night, Frank spread the articles across Dot's table and walked her through his discoveries. As the story unfolded, Dot's expression grew increasingly troubled. "So you're saying the woman who came to the shelter today might be this Claire Chen, Robert's niece, but the obituary says she passed away." "People fake their own passing for lots of reasons," Frank said darkly. "Usually because they're running from something, and if she's been hiding for 5 years, Major's sudden reappearance would be a serious threat to whatever new life she's built." Dot studied the obituary photo, comparing it to her memory of the woman from the shelter. "It could be her, I suppose. But Frank, what are you suggesting? That she started the fire? That she's responsible for her uncle's passing?" "I don't know what to think yet, but I know that woman was lying today, and I know Major reacted to her like she was a threat, not a beloved owner. Dogs don't lie, Dot. People do." The next morning, Frank arrived at the shelter early, bringing the articles to share with Linda and Dr. Rodriguez. They were studying the documents when the woman calling herself Claire Morrison arrived, carrying a folder that she claimed contained Major's papers. "I apologize for the confusion yesterday," she said, her demeanor more composed than it had been the previous day. "I was emotional about finding Rex after being so worried. I brought all his documentation." Linda accepted the folder and began reviewing the contents, while Frank positioned himself where he could observe both the woman and Major's reaction to her presence. Once again, the dog showed signs of stress when she appeared, moving away from her and positioning himself near the shelter entrance as if preparing to flee. The documents appeared professionally done: vaccination records, registration papers, even what looked like training certificates. But Dr. Rodriguez, examining them with a veterinarian's eye for detail, began to notice inconsistencies. "These vaccination records show Rex receiving his rabies vaccine 3 months ago," she said slowly. "But the batch number on this certificate was recalled by the manufacturer 6 months ago for contamination issues. It would be impossible for him to have received this particular vaccine 3 months ago." The woman's face flushed slightly. "Well, maybe there's an error in the paperwork. Veterinary offices make mistakes all the time." Frank stepped forward with the newspaper articles. "Ma'am, I think we need to have a different conversation, one about Robert Chen and Chen's Canine Training Academy. And what really happened the night of the fire 5 years ago?" The color drained completely from the woman's face. For a moment, she looked as if she might faint, but then her expression hardened into something cold and calculating. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Really? Because you bear a remarkable resemblance to Claire Chen, Robert's niece. The same Claire Chen who supposedly perished in a car accident 6 months after the fire that ended her uncle's life." The silence in the shelter was broken only by the sound of dogs barking in the back kennels and Major's heavy breathing as he watched the confrontation unfold. "You can't prove anything," the woman said finally, abandoning any pretense of being a concerned pet owner. "You do, and you have no right to keep my property." "Major isn't your property," Linda said firmly. "And based on these forged documents and the questions that have been raised about your identity, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises." "You'll regret this," the woman said, her mask completely dropped now. "All of you will regret interfering in things you don't understand." After she left, the 3 adults stood in stunned silence, processing what had just occurred. "We need to call the police," Dr. Rodriguez said finally. Frank nodded slowly. "Yes, but first, we need to understand what we're dealing with. If that woman is Claire Chen, and if she's been hiding for 5 years, there's more to this story than just a training facility fire." As if sensing the gravity of the situation, Major approached the group and sat down, his intelligent eyes moving between their faces. Then, in a behavior none of them had seen before, he walked to the folder of forged documents and very deliberately knocked it to the floor with his paw. The message was clear: Whatever those papers claimed, they were lies. And Major, in his own way, was telling them that the truth was far more complicated and dangerous than any of them had imagined. Linda picked up the scattered papers, studying them one more time. "There's something else," she said quietly. "Look at the veterinarian's name on these vaccination records. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the same last name as the alias our visitor is using." Frank felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting in his mind. She's not just hiding her identity. She's created an entire false history, complete with fake veterinary records from a practice that probably doesn't exist. "The question is," Dr. Rodriguez said, "what is she hiding from? And why is Major such a threat to her that she's willing to risk exposure by trying to reclaim him?" Outside in the parking lot, Claire Morrison sat in her car, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. 5 years of building a new identity, 5 years of therapy and medication to deal with the guilt and nightmares. 5 years of telling herself that the fire was an accident and that no one would ever connect her to that terrible night. But Major was alive. And worse, he was in the hands of people who were asking the right questions. Soon, they would discover that the fire hadn't been an accident at all, but the result of her carelessness and desperation. They would learn about the experimental medications she had been diverting from the children's hospital, using Robert's therapy dogs as unwitting test subjects. Most damaging of all, they would discover that Robert Chen hadn't perished trying to save his animals. He had confronted her that night about the missing medications, and in the struggle that followed, the fire had started. She had escaped, leaving her uncle to face the consequences of her actions. Major had seen it all. He was the only witness to the truth, and as long as he lived, her secrets would never be safe. The day after Claire's confrontational visit to the shelter, Linda made a decision that would prove to be both transformative and dangerous. She called Dot early in the morning with an unusual request. "I know this might sound strange," Linda said over the phone, "but I think Major needs to spend some time outside the shelter environment. After yesterday's incident, he's been restless, almost anxious. I've never seen him like this before." Dot, who was preparing Tommy's breakfast, paused with a spoonful of oatmeal halfway to the toddler's mouth. "What are you suggesting?" "Well, your daughter mentioned that you have a small fenced yard behind your apartment. Would you consider fostering Major for a few days? Just until we figure out what our next steps should be. I think being around Tommy in a home environment might help him relax." The request was unprecedented. Dot had never considered herself a dog owner. She'd been focused on cats during her younger years, and since Tommy's arrival, pets had been the furthest thing from her mind. But the connection between her grandson and the German Shepherd had been undeniable from the very first day. "Let me talk to Sarah," Dot said finally, "and let me think about the practicalities. I'm not exactly equipped for a dog Major's size." But even as she spoke, she was watching Tommy bang his spoon against his high chair tray, and she could swear he was making sounds that resembled Major in his baby vocabulary. Sarah's reaction to the fostering proposal was predictably concerned. "Mom, you're already caring for a toddler full-time. Adding a large dog to that responsibility seems overwhelming." "It's just for a few days, sweetheart, and honestly, Major has been so good with Tommy. He seems to have natural protective instincts around children." "That's exactly what worries me," Sarah replied. "Protective instincts can turn into possessiveness or aggression. And what if this Claire person comes back and causes trouble? You could be putting yourself and Tommy in danger." But after a lengthy conversation, and with Frank's offer to help with dog-related expenses and daily check-ins, Sarah reluctantly agreed to a trial period. "1 week," she said firmly, "and at the first sign of any problems, Major goes back to the shelter." That afternoon, Frank helped transport Major to Dot's small apartment complex on Birch Street. The building was a modest 2-story structure from the 1970s, with a small communal yard that the landlord had grudgingly agreed to fence after years of tenant requests. Dot's ground floor unit had direct access to the yard, making it perfect for their temporary arrangement. Major's adaptation to domestic life was remarkably smooth. Within hours, he had established routines that seemed designed to accommodate Tommy's schedule. He positioned himself near the baby's play area during the day, creating a protective perimeter without being intrusive. During Tommy's nap times, Major rested quietly by the door, alert to any sounds from outside. But it was during the evening hours that the true depth of their bond became apparent. As Dot prepared Tommy for bed, Major would follow them to the nursery and lie down beside the crib. The toddler, who had always been a restless sleeper, began sleeping more peacefully with the dog's steady breathing, providing a comforting rhythm in the darkened room. "It's like he knows exactly what Tommy needs," Dot marveled to Frank during one of his daily visits. "Yesterday, Tommy was getting fussy before his afternoon nap, and Major went and brought him his favorite stuffed elephant. I didn't teach him to do that, he just knew." Frank nodded thoughtfully. "Dr. Rodriguez mentioned that therapy dogs are trained to read emotional states and respond appropriately. Major's previous work with sick children probably included a lot of comfort behaviors. What none of them realized was that their peaceful domestic arrangement was being observed. Claire had not given up her attempts to reclaim Major. She had simply changed her strategy. Instead of direct confrontation, she had begun surveillance, learning their routines and looking for opportunities. She had rented a small apartment across the street from Dot's building, using yet another false identity and paying cash for a month-to-month lease. From her second-floor window, she could observe the comings and goings of everyone involved in Major's care. She watched Frank's daily visits, noted Dr. Rodriguez's weekly health checks, and most importantly, studied the patterns of Dot and Tommy's daily walks. 3 days into Major's stay at Dot's apartment, the first warning sign appeared. Dot discovered that someone had been in her car overnight. The glove compartment was open, papers were scattered, and her GPS showed recent destination searches that she hadn't made. Nothing was stolen, but the message was clear: they were being watched. Frank immediately recognized the incident as intimidation rather than random vandalism. "Someone's trying to scare you," he told Dot bluntly. "And the question is whether we call the police now or wait to see what happens next." Dot's initial instinct was to involve law enforcement, but Linda raised concerns about Major's status. If the police get involved, they might require Major to be placed in official custody while they investigate. That could mean the city animal control facility, and we all know how that story ends. Dr. Rodriguez supported Linda's concerns. Major's health and psychological well-being have improved dramatically since he's been with Tommy. Disrupting that bond now could be genuinely harmful to both of them. The decision was made to increase security measures without involving official authorities. Frank arranged for additional lighting around Dot's building and recruited 2 friends from his security company to help with informal surveillance. They also established a communication protocol. Anyone who noticed anything suspicious would immediately contact the others. But Claire's next move caught them completely off guard. On a sunny Thursday morning, as Dot was pushing Tommy's stroller through Riverside Park with Major walking calmly beside them, they were approached by a woman in a business suit who identified herself as Janet Phillips from the county health department. "Mrs. Henderson, I need to speak with you about the dog you're harboring. We've received a complaint alleging that you're keeping an unlicensed animal without proper vaccinations or health certificates." Dot felt her heart sink. "I have all his veterinary records from Dr. Rodriguez. Major has been thoroughly examined and vaccinated." "I'm sure you believe that," the woman said in a tone that managed to be both sympathetic and condescending. "But we need to see official documentation from a licensed municipal veterinarian. Private veterinarians sometimes miss things that could pose public health risks." "What kind of things?" Dot asked. pulling Tommy's stroller closer to her. Rabies, distemper, parasites that could be transmitted to children. We've had reports that this particular animal has been living in unsanitary conditions and may have been exposed to diseases. Major, who had been calmly observing the conversation, suddenly became alert. His ears pricked forward, and he took a step closer to Tommy's stroller, positioning himself between the health department official and the baby. "I'll need you to surrender the animal for testing immediately," the woman continued. "It's really for your own safety and the safety of your grandchild. And if I refuse, then I'll have to report this as a potential public health violation. And animal control will be authorized to remove the dog by force. You could also face fines and potentially lose custody of your grandchild if he's deemed to be in an unsafe environment." The threat was expertly delivered, calm, professional, but devastating in its implications. Dot looked down at Tommy, who was reaching toward Major with obvious affection, then at the dog, whose protective stance suggested he understood more about the conversation than any animal should. "How long would this testing take?" she asked finally. "Usually about a week, maybe longer if we find anything concerning." Dot knew with cold certainty that if Major disappeared into the county testing facility, they would never see him again. Whatever forces were working against them had found an official way to remove the dog from their protection. "I need to make some phone calls," she said carefully. "Can I have until tomorrow to arrange this?" The woman handed her a business card. "Of course, but Mrs. Henderson, I want to stress the urgency of this situation. Every day that dog remains in contact with your grandchild, you're taking serious risks." After the health department official left, Dot called Frank immediately. Within an hour, he had arrived at the park with Linda and Dr. Rodriguez, and they held an emergency strategy session on a bench while Tommy napped in his stroller and Major maintained his protective vigil. "The whole thing stinks," Frank said bluntly. "I've never heard of the county health department proactively investigating privately fostered animals, and that woman's story about reports of unsanitary conditions doesn't make sense. Major's been under professional veterinary care since day one." Dr. Rodriguez was studying the business card the woman had left. "This address is real. It's the county health building downtown. But something feels off about this whole interaction. We need to verify that this Janet Phillips actually works for the health department," Linda suggested, "and we need to find out who filed the complaint." As they talked, none of them noticed the figure watching them from across the park, telephoto camera lens trained on their group. Claire Morrison was documenting everything, building a case that would justify whatever action she needed to take to reclaim Major and protect her carefully constructed new identity. That evening, as Dot prepared dinner, while Tommy played on the kitchen floor with Major serving as a patient playmate, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The forces arrayed against them seemed to have unlimited resources and official backing, while their small group was operating on determination and limited knowledge. But as she watched Tommy use Major's sturdy back to pull himself up to standing, then lean against the dog while practicing his balance, she knew that giving up wasn't an option. Whatever secrets Major held, whatever truths Claire Morrison was trying to hide, the bond between this child and this dog represented something pure and valuable in a situation that had become increasingly dark and complicated. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, and possibly the confrontation that had been building since that first afternoon in the abandoned shopping center. But tonight, in the warm glow of her small kitchen, with a baby's laughter and a dog's gentle breathing creating a soundtrack of domestic peace, Dot made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to surrender Major to anyone, no matter what official authority they claimed to represent. Some things were worth fighting for, and the love between a child and his protector was definitely one of them. Friday morning dawned grey and humid, with the kind of oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press down on everything like a heavy blanket. Dot had spent a restless night, alternating between checking on Tommy and watching Major Bishu, who had positioned himself by the front window with an alertness that suggested he sensed approaching danger. Frank arrived early with coffee and grim news. I called the county health department first thing this morning. They have no record of a Janet Phillips working there and no complaints filed about Major. The whole thing was a setup. So what do we do now? Dot asked, accepting the coffee gratefully while keeping one eye on Tommy, who was having his breakfast in the high chair. We document everything and prepare for whatever comes next. Linda's bringing a professional camera to record any future encounters, and Dr. Rodriguez is preparing a comprehensive health report on Major that should satisfy any legitimate concerns. But their planning was interrupted by an urgent knock at the door. Through the peephole, Dot could see Linda standing on the front steps, her face flushed with exertion and worry. "Dot, thank goodness you're here," Linda said as soon as the door opened. "I just got a call from someone claiming to be from Animal Control. They said they have a court order to remove Major immediately, and they're on their way here now." Frank's expression darkened. "A court order requires a legitimate complaint and due process. Nobody's had time to go through proper legal channels." That's what I told them, but they said the order was issued as an emergency public health measure. They'll be here within the hour. As if sensing the tension in the adult conversation, Major rose from his position by the window and moved to stand beside Tommy's high chair. The baby immediately reached down to pat the dog's head, babbling in his characteristic mixture of real words and infant sounds. "We need to think strategically," Frank said. "If they show up with fake paperwork and try to take Major by force, we're dealing with something beyond official intimidation. That's kidnapping, theft, or worse." Dot made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. "Then we don't give them the chance. Tommy and I are going for our morning walk right now, and Major's coming with us." "Dot, that might not be safe," Linda protested. "And if these people are willing to forge official documents, who knows what else they're capable of?" "Staying here definitely isn't safe," Dot replied, already moving to gather Tommy's diaper bag and stroller. "At least in public, we have witnesses and the possibility of help from real authorities." Frank nodded slowly. "She's right, and I'll follow at a distance. Keep an eye on things. If anything suspicious happens, I'll call the real police." 20 minutes later, Dot was pushing Tommy's stroller through the familiar streets of their neighborhood, with Major walking calmly beside them. She had chosen a route that would take them through the busiest parts of town, plenty of witnesses, lots of foot traffic, and easy access to stores and businesses if they needed refuge. They had just turned onto Main Street when Dot noticed the black sedan following them. It maintained a consistent distance, always staying about half a block behind, matching their pace exactly. When she slowed down to look in a shop window, the car slowed. When she speeded up, it speeded up. Major had noticed too. His ears were pricked forward, and he kept glancing back over his shoulder, his body language alert but not yet alarmed. Tommy, oblivious to the tension, was enjoying the outing, pointing at passing cars and chattering to his four-legged companion. The confrontation came as they approached Riverside Park, the same location where they had been approached by the fake health department official the day before. This time, it was two men in dark suits who stepped out of the sedan and approached them. "Ma'am, we're with Animal Control," the larger of the two men said, though neither displayed any identification. "We need to take custody of that dog immediately. I'd like to see your badges and the court order you mentioned," Dot replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "We don't need to show you anything," the second man said, moving closer to Major. "This is a public health emergency." That's when everything changed. As the second man reached toward Major's collar, the dog's demeanor shifted completely. his protective training, or dormant since his time at the Children's Hospital, reasserted itself with stunning clarity. He moved between the men and Tommy's stroller, his posture radiating controlled power and absolute determination. "Back away from the child," Frank's voice came from behind them. He had arrived faster than expected, and he wasn't alone. Dr. Rodriguez was with him, along with two uniformed police officers who looked considerably more official than the men in suits. "Officers," Dot said, relief flooding her voice, "these men are impersonating animal control officers and attempting to take my dog without proper documentation." One of the real police officers, a woman in her 30s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped forward. "Gentlemen, we're going to need to see some identification and any legal documents authorizing you to seize this animal." The two fake officials exchanged glances, and Dot could see them calculating their options. The larger man reached into his jacket, and for a terrifying moment, everyone tensed. But instead of producing identification, he pulled out a cell phone and made a quick call. "We need to abort," he said quietly. "Too many witnesses. Real cops are here." As the men retreated toward their sedan, the female police officer called after them. "And we're going to need you to stop and answer some questions." But the black car was already pulling away from the curb, disappearing into traffic before anyone could react quickly enough to stop them. "Well, that was interesting," the police officer said, turning to address Dot and her group. "I'm Officer Sarah Martinez, and this is Officer Johnson. We got a call about suspicious activity involving fake officials and potential animal theft." Frank stepped forward. "I'm the one who called it in. We've been dealing with harassment related to this dog for several days now, and it's escalated to the point where we feared for everyone's safety." As Officer Martinez took statements from everyone present, a commotion from across the park caught their attention. Tommy had been growing restless in his stroller, and Dot had been distracted by the police interviews. In a moment that lasted no more than a few seconds, the toddler had managed to unbuckle himself and climb out of the stroller. With the fearless curiosity that only 18-month-olds possess, Tommy had spotted a cluster of pigeons near the park's decorative fountain and had begun toddling toward them with determined steps. The fountain was surrounded by a low concrete border, beyond which was a steep drop into the park's drainage creek. Major saw the danger before any of the adults. The German Shepherd launched himself across the park with speed that took everyone's breath away. He reached Tommy just as the toddler approached the concrete border, gently but firmly positioning himself between the child and the potential fall. When Tommy tried to continue toward the pigeons, Major carefully herded him away from the edge, using his body to guide the little boy back toward the group of worried adults. Officer Martinez witnessed the entire sequence. "That," she said with genuine amazement, "was not the behavior of a dangerous or unstable animal. That was the behavior of a highly trained protection dog." Dr. Rodriguez was examining Tommy to make sure he hadn't been frightened by Major's intervention, but the toddler was giggling and trying to hug the dog's neck, clearly viewing the entire episode as a fun game. "That settles it for me," Dot said firmly. "Major isn't going anywhere. He's part of our family now. Officially and permanently." The resolution of their immediate crisis came faster than anyone had expected. Officer Martinez contacted her supervisor, who authorized a formal investigation into the fake officials and forged documents. Within hours, the investigation had uncovered the rental apartment where Claire Morrison had been conducting her surveillance, complete with photographs and detailed notes about their daily routines. But Claire herself had vanished, leaving behind only a hastily packed apartment and a trail of false identities that would take weeks to untangle completely. A search of her abandoned belongings revealed medication bottles with labels from St. Mary's Children's Hospital, confirming Frank's suspicions about her connection to the facility where Major had once worked. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the pediatric ward director, was contacted as part of the investigation. Her testimony filled in the final pieces of the puzzle. Claire Chen had been a pharmacy technician who had been suspected of diverting experimental medications intended for child cancer patients. Robert Chen had discovered her activities and confronted her on the night of the fire, which had started during their struggle over evidence of her theft. Robert was trying to protect those children, Dr. Warren told the investigators. He knew that Claire's actions could have compromised their treatment protocols. Major was there that night. He saw everything that happened. The revelation explained Major's reaction to Claire's appearance at the shelter. He had recognized her as the person responsible for his beloved trainer's fate and the destruction of the therapy program he had devoted his life to serving. The revelation explained Major's reaction to Claire's appearance at the shelter. He had recognized her as the person responsible for his beloved trainer's fate and the destruction of the therapy program he had devoted his life to serving. 6 months later, Dot's small apartment had been transformed to accommodate their expanded family. Major had his own bed in Tommy's room, where he continued to serve as both protector and playmate. The bond between them had deepened into something that transcended the usual relationship between child and pet, becoming instead a partnership built on mutual trust and unconditional love. Frank had become a regular fixture in their lives, helping with dog-related expenses and serving as Major's official trainer for the therapy dog certification he was pursuing. Linda visited weekly, marveling at Major's continued progress and his obvious contentment in his new role as family guardian. Dr. Rodriguez had documented Major's story for a veterinary journal, turning their experience into a case study about the remarkable resilience and loyalty of therapy animals. The article attracted attention from other therapy dog programs, leading to speaking engagements and consultation opportunities that helped fund Major's ongoing care. Linda visited weekly, marveling at Major's continued progress and his obvious contentment in his new role as family guardian. Dr. Rodriguez had documented Major's story for a veterinary journal, turning their experience into a case study about the remarkable resilience and loyalty of therapy animals. The article attracted attention from other therapy dog programs, leading to speaking engagements and consultation opportunities that helped fund Major's ongoing care. Tommy had begun walking with confidence, always with Major at his side, ready to provide stability when the toddler's steps grew unsteady. His first clear word hadn't been mama or dada. It had been Major, spoken with perfect clarity while hugging his four-legged best friend. Sarah had initially worried about the liability and responsibility of housing a large dog, but Major's gentle nature and obvious devotion to Tommy had won her over completely. She often joked that she felt safer leaving her son with Dot and Major than she had when it was just her mother providing childcare. The broader community had embraced Major's story as well. The local newspaper ran a feature article about his journey from abandoned animal to family hero, inspiring donations to Riverside Animal Haven and leading to successful adoptions for several other dogs who had been waiting for homes. But the most meaningful transformation had been in Dot herself. At 72, she had discovered that her capacity for love and adventure was far from exhausted. Taking in Major had reminded her that the most important decisions in life are often made with the heart rather than the head, and that sometimes the greatest rewards come from the greatest risks. As she watched Tommy and Major play in their small backyard on a sunny September afternoon, Dot reflected on the chain of events that had brought them together. It had started with a simple act of kindness, a toddler offering his pacifier to a suffering animal, and had grown into something that had changed all their lives in ways none of them could have predicted. Major had found his purpose again, not in the sterile halls of a hospital, but in the warm chaos of a family home where a little boy needed protection, guidance, and unconditional love. Tommy had gained not just a pet, but a companion who would help shape his understanding of loyalty, courage, and compassion. And Dot had learned that heroism isn't always about dramatic rescues or life-threatening situations. Sometimes it's about recognizing when something precious needs protecting and finding the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the odds seem overwhelming. The pacifier that had started it all still made appearances during their daily routines. Though Tommy was gradually outgrowing his need for it, but whenever he was particularly tired or upset, he would offer it to Major, who would gently hold it for a moment before returning it with the patient dignity that had made him such an effective therapy dog. In those moments, watching the pure generosity that flowed between a child and his protector, Dot understood that they had participated in something much larger than a simple animal rescue. They had witnessed and preserved the kind of love that makes the world a better place, one small act of kindness at a time. The story of Major and Tommy had become something of a local legend, inspiring other acts of kindness throughout their community. Teachers were using their story in classrooms to talk about empathy and responsibility. Social workers were sharing it with families considering pet adoption. Even the city council had passed a resolution encouraging support for local animal shelters and therapy animal programs. But for Dot, Frank, Linda, and Dr. Rodriguez, the most important legacy of their experience wasn't the publicity or recognition. It was the quiet daily reality of watching a child and a dog who had both suffered trauma find healing in each other's company. Every morning when Tommy woke up and immediately looked for Major, every evening when the dog settled beside the crib to stand guard through the night, they were reminded that love has the power to transform even the most damaged hearts. As autumn approached and Tommy celebrated his second birthday with Major by his side, Dot knew that their adventure was far from over. Tommy would grow up with Major as his constant companion, learning lessons about loyalty, courage, and compassion that would shape the man he would become. And Major would continue his work as a therapy dog, bringing comfort to children in the hospital while maintaining his most important role as protector and friend to the little boy who had offered him a pacifier when he had nothing left to hope for. The bond between them had become something that transcended species, age, and circumstance. It was a reminder that in a world that often seems divided by differences, love remains the most powerful force for bringing beings together and healing the wounds that life inevitably inflicts. Years later, when Tommy was old enough to understand the full story of how Major came into their lives, Dot would tell him about the day they found a broken-hearted dog in a shopping cart and how a simple act of kindness had changed everything. She would explain how sometimes the most important friendships begin with the smallest gestures, and how the greatest heroes are often the ones who show up quietly day after day to protect and care for those they love. But for now, in the golden afternoon light of their small backyard, watching a toddler and a German shepherd play together with the unself-conscious joy that only comes from perfect trust, Dot was content to simply witness the miracle they had all helped create. Love had found a way, as it always does, to heal the broken places and make something beautiful from the fragments of what had been lost. Dear listeners, we hope Major and Tommy's incredible journey has touched your hearts as deeply as it touched ours. This story of unexpected friendship, courage in the face of adversity, and the transformative power of unconditional love reminds us that heroes come in all shapes and sizes, sometimes with 4 paws and a heart full of devotion. If this tale of loyalty and second chances moved you, we invite you to explore our special playlist of equally captivating stories about the bonds that connect us all. You can find it by clicking to your left. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Your support helps us continue bringing these heartwarming stories to life every single day. We've prepared many more tales that celebrate the complexity and beauty of life's unexpected moments. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing how these stories resonate with your own experiences. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey, and we'll see you in our next story.